Good evening. Let's begin tonight with a pause. Not a silence exactly, but a pause where pressure used to sit. Because today the European Commission announced that it plans to propose a 6-month suspension of a very large retaliatory tariff package against the United States. 93 billion euros. That is one number. And it matters. The package, as designed, was a response, not a first move, not an opening gambit. It was retaliation. The retaliation was aimed at the United States, specifically in response to a threat from Washington to impose new tariffs on 8 European countries. That threat, importantly, has now been removed. And because that threat has been removed, the European Commission says it will now move to suspend its own response. This is not cancellation, it is suspension. And the distinction is not rhetorical. The Commission's announcement makes clear that the suspension is planned for 6 months. It is time-limited. It is reversible. It is deliberate. The retaliatory package itself, the one now set to be suspended, was valued at $93 billion. That translates to roughly $109.19 billion. Those figures were not symbolic. They were calibrated. The suspension was previously set to take effect on February 7, 2026. That date still stands. The mechanism remains in place. What has changed is not the existence of the package. What has changed is the context in which it sits. The European Commission's statement ties this move directly to the United States dropping its threat. No threat, no immediate retaliation. And the original threat from Washington was not abstract. It was linked to tensions involving Greenland. Those tensions were tied to 8 European countries, and they carried with them the possibility of new US tariffs. That possibility has now been removed, and so the response adjusts. There is a rhythm to this that matters, because trade actions like these do not exist in isolation. They exist in sequence. First there was a threat, then there was a prepared response. Now there is a pause. The Commission is explicit that the retaliatory measures could be reactivated if necessary. That is not a warning. It is a condition. The package is not dismantled. It is not forgotten. It is simply not being deployed. And that choice is framed as part of a broader effort. An effort, the Commission says, to reset trade cooperation. That phrase is doing work here. Reset trade cooperation. It implies that something had been strained, that lines of communication had tightened, that leverage had been placed on the table, and now, with the tariff threat removed, there is room to step back. One official description of the moment captures it this way: "This is a pause, not an erasure." That is not a quote from the Commission. It is a description of the posture. But the Commission's own language stays careful. Measured, procedural, they announce plans to propose the suspension. They did not declare an immediate end. Because in trade policy, intention matters, process matters. The 6-month suspension is itself a signal. It says cooperation is possible. It also says consequences remain possible. Nothing here is impulsive. Nothing here is improvised. The retaliatory package had been prepared with a start date, February 7, 2026. That date now functions differently. It marks a moment of restraint rather than escalation. And this is where the emotional center of this moment quietly sits. Because at its core, this is about choosing not to act, at least not yet. One line spoken quietly sums it up best. We're stepping back, not stepping away. The Commission is careful to note that the suspension remains in place, but could be reactivated if necessary. That sentence does a lot of work. It reassures domestic audiences that leverage has not been surrendered. It signals to Washington that the response is conditional, and it preserves room for cooperation. All of this follows directly from the removal of the US tariff threat. That removal is the hinge point. No new tariffs, no immediate retaliation. This is not a resolution. It is a recalibration. And it is happening within a defined window of time. 6 months, enough time to talk, enough time to assess, enough time to decide whether this pause becomes something more lasting. The European Commission describes this move as part of efforts to reset trade cooperation. That is the official framing. Reset implies that cooperation existed before, that it can exist again. And in that sense, this announcement is less about what is happening now and more about what is being deliberately avoided. Another line, simple and human, captures the moment. Sometimes not pulling the lever is the point. This is the setup. A major retaliatory trade package, a removed threat, a planned suspension, and a window of time in which nothing happens by design. And from here, the details matter, the timing matters, the conditions matter. Because in trade policy, what is not done can matter just as much as what is. And that brings us deeper into how this suspension fits into the broader mechanics of the response that was already built and waiting. When the European Commission talks about this suspension, it is not speaking casually. It is referring to a mechanism that already exists, a structure that was assembled in anticipation of escalation, not improvisation. The $93 billion retaliatory tariff package did not appear overnight. It was designed as a response to a specific U.S. threat, a threat to impose new tariffs on 8 European countries. Those 8 countries were connected to tensions over Greenland. That connection matters because it defines the scope and origin of the dispute. This was not a general trade disagreement. It was targeted. When Washington raised the possibility of those tariffs, the European Union prepared its answer. That answer was formal, measured, and explicitly retaliatory. The Commission's plan was clear. If the U.S. tariffs moved forward, the EU response would follow, and the timing was set, February 7, 2026. That date was not arbitrary. It was chosen to allow space for dialogue before action, space that, at the time, still carried uncertainty. The suspension that has now been announced does not erase that date. It changes what that date represents. Instead of marking the start of retaliation, it now marks the continuation of restraint. The Commission says the suspension was previously set to take effect on that same date, and it remains in place. That phrasing is precise, the suspension is active, the package exists, and the ability to reapply it remains intact. This is not a reversal, it is a holding pattern. The reason for that holding pattern is singular and clearly stated. The United States removed its threat to impose the new tariffs. That removal is the trigger for the EU's response adjustment. Nothing else in the underlying structure has changed. The retaliatory package remains fully defined. Its value remains $93 billion. Its scope remains what it was. And crucially, the Commission is explicit that it could be reactivated if necessary. That conditionality is central to understanding this moment. Because in trade relations, leverage is not only about action, it is about readiness. By suspending rather than withdrawing, the EU is preserving its position. It is signaling restraint without relinquishing capability. One sentence captures the posture cleanly. We're ready, but we're waiting. That waiting is not passive, it is strategic. The Commission frames the suspension as part of efforts to reset trade cooperation. Again, that phrase is deliberate. Reset implies interruption, not collapse. It suggests that cooperation is the default state, even if strained. The removal of the U.S. tariff threat creates the conditions for that reset. And the EU's suspension is the corresponding move. This is reciprocal de-escalation, threat removed, retaliation paused. The Commission does not describe this as a victory. It does not describe it as a concession. It describes it as a response to changed circumstances. That distinction matters, because nothing in the announcement suggests that the underlying disagreement has been resolved. Only that one immediate point of friction has been removed. The mention of Greenland is not incidental. It situates the dispute geographically and politically. 8 European countries were implicated. The U.S. threat targeted them specifically. By removing that threat, Washington changed the immediate landscape, and the EU adjusted accordingly. The mechanics of this adjustment are procedural. The Commission announced plans to propose the suspension. That means there is still a formal process to follow. This is not a unilateral switch being flipped in isolation. Trade policy moves through institutions. It moves through proposals, approvals, and implementation. The announcement signals intent. It does not shortcut governance. And the 6-month duration of the suspension is part of that governance logic. 6 months is long enough to matter. It is short enough to maintain pressure. It creates a window, not an open-ended pause. During that window, trade cooperation can be reassessed. Communication can be tested. Trust, if possible, can be rebuilt, but the consequences remain visible. The retaliatory package is not shelved, it is not dismantled, it is paused with conditions. That condition is necessity. If the circumstances that led to the package return, the package can return too. This is why the Commission emphasizes that the suspension could be reactivated. That phrase appears deliberately. It reminds all parties that restraint is contingent. Another line, quiet but clear, captures the logic. The tools stay on the table. There is also a temporal symmetry here that is worth noticing. The original tariff threat was future-facing, so was the EU's response. Now both are paused before implementation. Nothing has yet taken effect. Everything has been prepared. This is a moment where preparation meets choice. The Commission's announcement is careful not to extend beyond the facts. It does not speculate about future outcomes. It does not predict success. It simply states what is happening now. A proposed 6-month suspension, a retaliatory package valued at $93 billion, a US tariff threat removed, an effort to reset cooperation. Those are the facts. And within those facts, there is a clear sequence: threat, response prepared, threat removed, response suspended. That sequence is important because it shows cause and effect without interpretation. The Commission does not need to editorialize. The timeline speaks for itself. And in the world of international trade, timelines are arguments. They show who moved first. They show who responded. They show who stepped back. This step back is measured. It does not foreclose future action. It does not assume goodwill. It creates space. Space in trade policy is not empty. It is filled with meetings, assessments, and recalculations. But publicly, what we see is stillness. A large package waiting, a date repurposed, a suspension holding. And that brings us to the broader significance of how this moment fits into ongoing efforts to redefine cooperation after tension. Because this is not just about what was suspended, it is about why the suspension exists at all. So, this is where things stand. A retaliatory tariff package valued at $93 billion remains fully constructed. Its purpose has not changed. Its scope has not changed. What has changed is the immediate necessity to use it. The European Commission's announcement does not describe an end. It describes a pause, a suspension, proposed for 6 months. That 6-month window exists because the United States removed its threat to impose new tariffs. Those tariffs would have applied to 8 European countries. They were tied directly to tensions over Greenland. With that threat gone, the Commission adjusted its posture. This adjustment is presented as part of efforts to reset trade cooperation. That phrase, again, is the key. Reset does not mean resolve. It does not mean agree. It means return to a point where cooperation is possible. The Commission's language is careful to stay inside the boundaries of fact. It does not promise progress. It does not declare success. It simply acknowledges a change in conditions. The suspension was previously set to take effect on February 7, 2026. That date remains central. It now functions as a marker of restraint rather than escalation. A reminder that action was prepared but deliberately withheld. The retaliatory package remains in place. The Commission is explicit about this. It could be reactivated if necessary. That sentence carries weight because it preserves balance. It reassures European stakeholders that leverage still exists. It signals to Washington that restraint is conditional. Nothing here is final. And that, in many ways, is the point. Trade policy often operates in the space between action and inaction, between threat and follow-through. This moment sits precisely there. A tool has been built. The circumstances that would trigger its use have shifted. So the tool waits. The Commission's announcement is not dramatic, it is procedural. And that is intentional, because in international trade, calm language is often the strongest signal. The absence of urgency in the statement reflects a deliberate slowing, a decision not to escalate while escalation is unnecessary. This is not framed as a concession, it is framed as a response. The United States removed its tariff threat. The European Union responded by suspending its retaliation. That symmetry matters. It shows a sequence where actions are met with corresponding adjustments, not overreactions, not underreactions, just calibrated movement. The 6-month duration also matters. It establishes a defined period for reassessment, not an indefinite wait, not an open-ended freeze. During that time, trade cooperation can be examined, processes can be tested, tensions can either ease or resurface. The Commission does not say what will happen during those 6 months. It does not speculate. It only defines the parameters. Suspension now, reactivation possible later. That clarity is itself a stabilizing force, because uncertainty in trade policy often comes from ambiguity. Here the conditions are spelled out. If the circumstances that justified the retaliatory package return, the package can return too. Until then, it remains unused. One short line captures the emotional core of this moment. We're choosing not to push the button. That choice reflects a preference for de-escalation without disarmament, and it aligns with the Commission's stated goal of resetting cooperation. Resetting does not mean forgetting what happened. It means acknowledging it and then adjusting behavior accordingly. The original tariff threat created pressure. The retaliatory package formalized that pressure. Now, with the threat removed, the pressure is eased, but not eliminated. It is stored. This storage of pressure is what makes the suspension credible. If the package had been withdrawn entirely, the signal would be different. But that is not what happened. The package remains in place. The Commission has made that unmistakably clear. This approach preserves optionality. And optionality is central to trade negotiations. It allows parties to respond dynamically rather than reactively. It keeps lines open without closing doors. The Commission's announcement is also notable for what it does not include. There are no accusations, no language of blame, no rhetorical escalation. The focus stays on process and timing. Plans to propose a suspension, a 6-month duration, a removed threat, an effort to reset cooperation. That is the full frame. Everything else remains outside the statement, and that restraint is consistent with the moment, because at this stage the most important thing is not what is said, but what is not done. No tariffs imposed, no retaliation enacted, just a pause. A pause that is structured, conditional, and time-bound. The Commission's move acknowledges that trade relationships are not static. They shift in response to actions taken and actions withdrawn. This is an example of that dynamic in real time. The threat changed, so the response changed. Nothing more, nothing less. As the 6-month suspension unfolds, the underlying mechanisms remain ready. They are neither forgotten nor dismantled. They wait. And waiting in this context is not weakness, it is control. Another quiet line captures the tone of this moment. We're holding steady while conditions are reassessed, holding steady while cooperation is tested, holding steady with tools still in hand. This is how the Commission has chosen to mark this moment, not with a declaration, not with a demand, but with a pause that carries meaning precisely because it could have been something else. And with that, the script comes to its natural close. The facts are set, the sequence is clear, the process is defined. What happens next will depend on whether the conditions that prompted this pause continue to hold. For now, the retaliatory package remains suspended. The threat that prompted it remains removed. And trade cooperation, at least in this narrow sense, is being given space.